My father was a man of hands, not words. That's the truest thing I can tell you about him. He could rebuild a carburetor by feel in the dark. He could set a cracked bone on a calf without the animal making a sound. He could lay a bead of weld so clean it looked like a seam God had put there. His hands knew every language a man needs to survive in the hill country of eastern Tennessee, but the words, the simple, ordinary words that a son needs to hear at least once before the world takes his father away, those never came. Not once. Not in 12 years of mornings. I don't say this to make him small. He was not a small man in any way that mattered. He worked 14 hours most days at a one-bay garage off the state road, came home with grease under his nails and supper on the table before I'd finished my homework, and every single night he checked the lock on my window before he turned out the light in the hall. He just never said it. I used to watch him at the dinner table. He'd get this look, this almost there look, like the sentence was already in his chest and all it needed was air, and then he'd clear his throat and ask me to pass the salt, and the moment would close like water over a stone. He died on a Tuesday in November. A patch of black ice on the county road, a guardrail that gave, and then 11 years of silence where my father used to be. I was 12. I am 23 now. And for all those years between, that unfinished sentence sat in me like a splinter too deep to find. People at the funeral told me he was proud of me. Teachers. Neighbors. The men who ran the hardware store and had known my father since they were boys. They all said some version of the same thing, that he talked about me, that his eyes lit up, that you could hear it in his voice. I believed them. I did. But belief and hearing are different things, and no amount of second-hand love quite fills the space where the words themselves should have lived. I used to think that made me ungrateful. I grew up enough to understand it just made me human. I tried everything a young man tries. I moved fast, worked fast, kept busy. I took a job at a warehouse on the edge of town and drove long routes when they needed drivers, not because the money was good, which it wasn't, but because the road at night has a way of making the quiet in your head feel like a choice instead of a wound. I told myself I was fine. I mostly believed it. But there were nights, especially in November, when I'd pull over on an empty highway and sit with the engine ticking and feel the exact size and shape of the thing my father never gave me. The night everything changed was one of those November nights. I was coming back from a delivery run on a 2-lane county road about 40 miles east of home, state road, no shoulder worth the name, rain coming down like the sky had made up its mind. My headlights picked up something on the blacktop about 200 yards ahead, and I slowed without thinking, because that's what my father always said, slow down when something doesn't look right. Even at 12 I knew that rule by heart. What I found was a motorcycle on its side across the lane, and a man pinned beneath the rear quarter of it, not trapped by the frame, but by the weight and the angle, his leg caught under the saddlebag housing and his arm twisted back wrong. He was conscious. Barely. He had on a full leather cut, soaked through, with an MC patch across the back that I didn't stop to read. He was big, the kind of man who fills a doorway, and the bike was a heavy touring machine, and together they probably outweighed me by 400 pounds. None of that math entered my mind. I don't say that to sound brave. I say it because my father's hands were apparently the thing he did pass on to me, even if his words weren't. I got my truck crossways on the road with the hazards going, grabbed the come-along strap from behind the seat, and spent the next 7 minutes getting that bike off him, looping the strap around the frame, anchoring to my truck's hitch, ratcheting slow while I talked to him the whole time so he'd stay awake. I didn't know what to talk about. I talked about the rain. I talked about the county road's reputation for black ice in November, which in hindsight was not the most comforting topic, but he kept his eyes open and that was what mattered. The rain was cold enough to sting. When the bike finally lifted enough, I got under his leg with my shoulder and walked him out from under it, and he made a sound I won't describe but that I recognized as the sound a man makes when he's been hurting so long that the relief of it is almost worse than the pain. I got him into my truck cab and cranked the heat. He had a gash on his forearm that had bled through his sleeve, and I wrapped it with the shop rag I kept behind the seat, same thing my father used to keep there for the same reason, and I noticed that without meaning to. I called emergency services and gave the mile marker. Then I sat there with him, engine running, rain hammering the roof, while we waited for the ambulance. He didn't say much. Neither did I. When the paramedics finally arrived and got him onto the stretcher, he reached back and grabbed my wrist with his good hand and looked at me with eyes that were clear all of a sudden, clearer than I expected, and he said, "What's your name, son?" I told him. He asked my father's name without explaining why, the way a man asks when he already has a reason. I told him that too. He went still for just a second. Then the paramedics moved him into the rig, and the doors closed, and I drove home in the rain thinking nothing particular except that I hoped the man's leg was all right. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning at 7:30, I heard them. You don't hear 67 motorcycles the way you hear ordinary traffic. It's not a sound so much as a change in the air, a low rolling pressure that you feel in your sternum before your ears sort it out. I'd heard maybe a handful of bikes at once before, the kind that pass through on summer weekends, but this was different in the way a tide is different from a wave. It keeps coming. I was standing at the kitchen window with a coffee mug going cold in my hand, and I watched them come up my road, 2 by 2, leather cuts, beards, the orderly unhurried procession of men who have ridden a long way and are not in any hurry now that they've arrived. The rising sun caught the chrome on the lead machine and threw a bar of light across my kitchen wall, and for just a moment I thought I was still asleep. The road captain I'd pulled off the blacktop was at the front of the column. His leg was in a brace but he was upright on his machine, and he rode it to the end of my gravel drive and put the kickstand down with a care that told me the leg was still speaking to him. The others filled the road behind him until there were motorcycles as far as I could see, and then the engines went quiet, one by one, in the particular silence of many men choosing to be still at the same time. I came out onto the porch. I didn't know what else to do. The road captain walked up my drive, slow, one hand on the railing of the fence post, but straight. He was a big man and he was broader in the daylight than he'd seemed in the rain. He wore his road captain's patch like it was a part of his body. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at me and said, "Your father's name was on our roll for 9 years." I didn't understand him. I said so. He told me. My father had run supplies for their chapter twice a year on his route, quiet work, nothing dramatic, just a man with a truck and a willingness to drive. He'd never asked for money and never joined up, just did what needed doing whenever the club needed a reliable hand in the county. 9 years. I had been 12 when he died, which meant he'd started when I was 3, and I had never known. I thought of all the early Saturday mornings I'd woken to find his truck already gone from the drive, and how he'd always been back before supper with some quiet explanation about a parts run or a county delivery. I'd never questioned it. I had been a child, and children believe what their fathers tell them, and now I understood that what he'd told me wasn't a lie, it was just the smallest part of the truth. He talked about you, the road captain said. Every time he came around. Said you were going to be something. Said it was the one thing he knew for certain. He paused then, and looked off toward the road where the rest of them waited, row on row, engines still. He also said, every time, without fail, right before he drove off, that he wished he was better at saying it out loud to you directly. I had to put my hand on the porch rail. He told us, the road captain said simply. Every one of these men. Your father said it to us the way he couldn't say it to you. And we figured, since you're the one who pulled me off that road, you ought to hear it. He stepped back then. He turned toward the road. And the man nearest the front of the column, a gray-bearded rider built like a fireplace, stepped forward to the foot of my drive and said it. 3 words, plain and without ceremony, the way a man says a thing he means. Then the next man. Then the next. I will not tell you I held it together. I am telling you this story 11 months later, and I still cannot get all the way through it without my voice going. What I can tell you is that 67 men stood in my gravel road on a cold Saturday morning and said the thing my father carried in his chest for 12 years. By the time they reached the last man in the column, I was sitting on the top porch step with my face in my hands, and the road captain was standing beside me with one heavy hand on my shoulder, not saying anything, which was exactly right. They stayed for an hour. Some of them told me stories about my father I'd never heard, a clutch he repaired in a parking lot in a snowstorm, a delivery he made on a busted axle that he fixed himself on the side of the road with parts he improvised from what he had in the bed of the truck. Small things. The kinds of things a man does when he has a code and just does the next right thing without keeping score. One of them, an older man with a long silver braid and a sergeant-at-arms patch, told me that my father used to bring a thermos of coffee on his supply runs, that he always had a cup ready for whoever was loading or unloading, winter or summer, without being asked. That detail hit me harder than most because I remembered that thermos. Dented green metal. It sat on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet my entire childhood, and I never knew where it went on those twice-yearly mornings when my father left before dawn. Before they left, the road captain told me the club kept a roll. My father's name was still on it. He asked, quietly, if I'd object to it staying there. I told him I wouldn't object to that at all. They rode out the way they came in, 2 by 2, unhurried, the sound of them fading slowly down the county road until the morning was quiet again. I stood on the porch until I couldn't hear them anymore. The coffee was completely cold. The gravel in my drive had 67 sets of tire tracks pressed into it, and I stood there looking at them for a long time. My father was a man of hands, not words. I understand that differently now. The words were always there. He just gave them to the men he trusted, and those men held them for 11 years without knowing they'd one day need to carry them up a gravel drive to a boy who'd grown into someone his father would have been proud of. I know that now. I know it because 67 riders told me so on a cold November morning, and not one of them had any reason to lie.